I'd like to introduce our main speaker today. We have compatriot William Covington. He is a member of the Arlington chapter. Sorry if this is echoing here. He's a teacher by profession, a history teacher. He's just completing 30 years of education or service as a teacher. He spent 14 years in the Dallas ISD teaching social studies and English as a second language. He's did several years as an adjunct instructor in different community colleges in the area. He's currently an instructor of social studies at Waxahachie Global High School in Waxahachie, and where he teaches world geography, world history, and U.S. history. And he's also an adjunct instructor of U.S., European, and Texas history at Navarro College, which is also Waxahachie. He native of Fort Worth and lives in Cedar Hill and has a wife and 3 children. We're going to try something a little different today. As you can see on the table, he's got several items he's going to be talking about, so we're going to try to use the other speaker system today, so bear with us.
Thank you, gentlemen and the esteemed ladies that are with us today. Whenever I go through an SAR or DAR meeting like this, I love to, and I will stay, when even the meeting, the portion of it that's going to come afterwards, I will certainly stay for it, the rest. But I learned so much, and I have things kind of happen that say, oh, you know, I need to say something about that because folks might not understand this, but when we sang My Country 'Tis of Thee, I mean, early on in American history, we were stealing a lot of tunes from other countries and just simply applying our own verbiage to those. That's the tune for God Save the King. And so for anyone who didn't know that, but of the 3 children that we have, my oldest son is a teacher up at Richardson ISD at Richardson High School. My youngest son, our middle child, is a captain in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Currently, he and his wife are stationed over at Camp Humphreys in Seoul, South Korea. But my daughter is the one of our 3 kids that decided that when she finished 8th grade, she felt like the school she was at a private school, that it was just simply too small. She wanted to experience a larger gene pool, if you want to say that, a school with more diversity. And so she requested to attend the high school I teach at down in Waxahachie. After her junior year, she won the DAR Good Citizens Award, which was awarded to her by the Rebecca Boyce chapter. And I've told her, if you ever join the DAR, she's currently teaching English in a small village about 250 miles north of Tokyo, Japan. She's been there for 3 years. Even the Japanese refer to this as the frozen north, because it doesn't snow, and this is no exaggeration, ladies and gentlemen, it does not snow 27 inches. It snows 27 feet in a winter. It starts in November and it doesn't stop till May. And so she said, I'm getting really, really tired of being cold all the time. And so, it appears now that she's going to go from teaching in Japan to teaching over in Seoul, South Korea. And so it's going to be a little bit longer before we get to see her again. But she was, I told her, I said, if you ever join the DAR, you need to join the Rebecca Boyce chapter because they were the ones who gave you the award. So talking about the Continental Soldier of the American Revolution, when the Revolution started, we had no army. And yet, we had the audacity to basically draw the line in the sand with the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and arguably one of the most powerful nations in world history, just on the other side of that line. And yet we felt like we would be able to pull this off. The American Revolution is the longest declared war we've ever fought, and it lasted for just over 8 years. If you look at proportionally the number of people that died in the American Revolution, it's the bloodiest war we've ever fought in, because we had about 2.5 million people, and 25,000 of them died during the American Revolution. The interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen, only 8,000 of those were battlefield casualties. 17,000 of them died either of disease or they died in British prisons. And I've got a whole presentation on British prisons there was no Geneva Convention at this time that said how prisoners could be treated. They were treated pretty poorly. And also too, this is the war in which we see the greatest age range in American soldiers, because there were boys as young as 12 carrying this musket right here, carrying a Brown Bess or a Charleville musket or a Committee of Safety musket, ones as young as 12 in the ranks with other soldiers. And some of the drummer boys and the fife players were even younger than that. Some of them were 5 or 6 years old. And I kind of imagine that probably what it was is the father of the family had been commissioned to command a company, and the wife probably said, "You're taking some of the kids with you because I don't want to have to watch all 8 of them, so you're going to take these 2 or 3 with you, so that you can watch them and I'll keep the rest here at home." But because so many of them, of the very, very young ones, the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, it turns out they were the sons of whoever the commander of that company, whoever the commander was. So we had no organized army, and so one of the first things that the Continental Congress did on June 14th, if that's correct, June 14th, 1775, was they created a Continental Army. They created an army. Now, the guys who composed this army, which were by and large New England farmers and New England shop owners, it was the men who had Boston sealed off from the rest. The British were in Boston, and this army of militiamen had basically cut it off from the landward side. They didn't know that they had just been made soldiers. And of course, and I believe that's what we celebrate today. On June 14th, it's Flag Day, and I think that's actually what we're recognizing as the founding of the U.S. Army. Well, the very next day, they appointed a commander-in-chief. They appointed George Washington, and I've heard that there were 3 reasons why they appointed Washington. One is he's the only delegate who showed up at the Second Continental Congress wearing a uniform. He had his uniform designed for him. He'd fought in the French and Indian War much earlier. And there's an interesting story behind that. He wanted to actually join the British Army, the regular British Army, and he petitioned the British to allow him to become an officer in the British Army. He was rejected on the basis of one I guess what you would say, disability that he had, and that was he couldn't speak French. And the British Army wanted all of their officers to be able to speak the language of the enemy, because the French were the enemy at that point. And so we came pretty close to losing our first commander-in-chief and losing our first president. Thank God he wasn't more proficient at languages. But he did have the uniform on. And so you have all these civilians talking about beginning to dabble in military matters, and they would say, well, that guy over there has got a uniform on, so maybe he knows a little bit more about this than we do. Also, too, it was his second thing, his imposing height. And this is the interesting thing. We do not know exactly how tall our first president was. He had been, no full body measurement had been taken of him while he was alive. He had been measured for certain articles of clothing, but he had never had a head-to-foot measurement. After he had passed, they took a measurement of him for his casket. He measured in at 6'3.5", but he's older at this point, and so it may have been that he had lost a little bit of height. So the best guess we have is that he was somewhere between 6'3.5" and 6'5", and he is our tallest president. He was actually taller than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had some things physical aspects of him that exaggerated his height. First of all, he's very thin. He also had unusually long arms, which when people are looking at him, makes him look even taller. And of course, he wore the stovepipe hat. But George Washington is, let's just go with 6'5", at a point in time when the average man was 5'6" to 5'8". So quite literally, he is head and shoulders above his contemporaries. I've always told classes of students he must have made a beautiful target when he was on horseback because he's so tall. But he was never wounded during the American Revolution. He was never wounded during the French and Indian War either. But at Braddock's defeat, after he was the only officer frequently still on his feet at Braddock's defeat, 900 soldiers died, British regulars and provincial colonials. And but it's said that when he removed his coat, he found 4 bullet holes in his coat. And so he was obviously being shot at, but none of them actually struck him. So again, he's very, very tall. But the third reason, and I think it's probably the most improbable, but it's one of my favorites, is that folks looked at his rugged features. They looked at his very good, he had the physique more of a professional quarterback than of the elder statesmen that we're used to seeing on our dollar bills. People looked at him and said, you know, when they finally start to make statues of famous Americans, he's going to look good as a statue, and so we need to go ahead and select him to be our somebody really important, and that turned into a commander-in-chief. When they finally commissioned him, he said, "I fear you may have given me a task that's far beyond my abilities." Not very comforting words for a country that has just declared itself to be in rebellion against the most powerful nation on earth. And he effectively left Philadelphia just in the company of a few other officers to ride from Philadelphia to Boston to take command of this army that he had been given charge of. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the single bloodiest day of the American Revolution, will take place while he's en route from Philadelphia to Boston. When he reaches Boston, he takes command of the army. He didn't think very highly of New Englanders. He said they're nasty, crafty people with ugly accents. He wrote that in his journal. And he felt like they were far too democratic in their approach. They would vote officers in and vote officers out. And of course, Washington had some other Southerners with him who had some very choice things to say about that. And but this is what he had to work with, and so when he again first arrived, probably the majority, I would not exclusively, but the majority of the militia groups that had shown up, the men were wearing something akin to this garment here. It's referred to as a hunting shirt, and but it's not a military garment. This is actually a civilian smock. It's a workman's smock. And the clothing that I have on here, the shirt, the vest, which is referred to as a waistcoat, compound word, a waistcoat, but it's pronounced waistcoat, and then my breeches, these all taken together are referred to as my small clothes. And if I was a laborer and didn't want to damage my small clothes, I would put this hunting shirt on over top of my small clothes, so that as I was working, if anything was going to get torn or damaged, it would be the outer garment rather than my small clothes. And so this could be worn by a farmer in his field, by a blacksmith at his forge, a carpenter in his shop, again, just in an effort to keep the small clothes clean and intact. Now, Washington saw these, and he felt like that this is a great way to make the army look relatively uniform all at once. And so now, believe it or not, there's only 2 shapes of fabric in this shirt. They're either squares or rectangles. And Washington thought that, oh, since there's only two shapes of cloth, these must be easy shirts to sew. I can have the men sew their own shirts. And of course, any of you ladies who've ever wielded needles, know there's no such thing as an easy garment to sew. And, but the New England colonies protested. They said, we don't want our soldiers looking like farmers carrying guns out in the field. So they protested. They said, we don't want to have these types of, our soldiers wearing these types of garments. We preferred them to be wearing the garment I'll talk about over here, the actual regimental coat. So, but the colonies that did put these together, Washington told the commanders of the regiments, I don't care what color the body of the coat is, that's up to you guys. But he selected 13 colors. He assigned one color to each of the colonies, and he said, I want you to dye the cuffs and the collar of the shirt that color, so that an officer who knows which colors are matched with which colony can visually identify on a battlefield where a group of soldiers are from. And red was the color that was assigned to the colony of Virginia. So Washington's fellow Virginians would have been wearing these early on in the American Revolution. Now, to talk about the gun, I should probably first talk about this. This is referred to as a cartridge box, and it hangs from my left shoulder down on my right-hand side, slightly behind, so that when I'm marching and I'm swinging my arm in time with my step, it wouldn't actually strike the box. I don't have to see the box to be able to obtain a cartridge from it. I can just reach back and feel for one and draw it out. And you all can see it's just simply an envelope of leather that has got a wooden block nailed inside of it. And the block has got a certain number of holes drilled in it. In each one of those holes, a cartridge for the musket. And now, this is an American cartridge box. British cartridge boxes usually held 60 rounds of ammunition. They would have 30 on one side. When you shot all those 30, you could insert your thumb and your forefinger into the holes, lift the whole box out, flip it over, and there are another 30 rounds on the other side. I've carried this box. Mine has got 24 holes in it. And I've carried it when it's been full of live rounds. And it's pretty heavy. So I can imagine for British carrying boxes that were over twice this weight. And of course, the average British soldier carried roughly 100 pounds of equipment with him. But this is what's referred to as a brown vest. The proper nomenclature for it, it's a Newland. It's a Newland pattern infantry musket, a brown vest second model. The British made tens of thousands of these guns. As a matter of fact, prior to the advent in 1947, the advent of the AK-47, which is today the most widely produced military weapon in the world, this was the most widely produced military weapon. There were three different models of it. They only really varied in the barrel length. A first model brown vest would have been about 4 inches longer. This is a second model brown vest. First model would have had a 46-inch barrel. This one's a 42-inch. And then a third model brown vest would have been 3 inches shorter. It had a 39-inch barrel. The first model was used during the French and Indian War, the second model during the American Revolution, and the third model during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, unlike Americans, when the British, we would take, after the Civil War, we used a whole lot of our Springfield muskets as rebar in dams and bridges and things like that. We used them for other means. The British would actually store their weapons, their obsolete weapons. They would store them in arsenals, and they were in the market of selling military surplus, more or less, to other nations of the world. And so these guns actually saw quite a bit of duty after the American Revolution. In February of 1836, when Santa Anna crossed the Rio Grande, he's headed towards San Antonio in the Battle of the Alamo. Gentlemen and ladies, it's one of the epic marches, one of the epic military marches in world history. He was pushing these guys at 40 miles a day. And that's what surprised the Texans, was he showed up about 2 weeks. They knew he was coming. They just didn't know how fast. And so when he showed up 2 weeks before they were ready for him to show up, then they got concerned. And but most of his musket men would have been carrying these kinds of muskets. During the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant was coming down the Mississippi River headed towards Vicksburg, and the longest true siege in American history. They took a little detour down the Tennessee River. They captured Fort Donelson. The entire arsenal in Fort Donelson, the entire Confederate arsenal, was stocked with these guns. The only difference being that the flint mechanism here had been removed, and they had placed a cap lock mechanism on it. And even as late as 1944, this is no exaggeration, gentlemen. As late as 1944, the British are pushing the Japanese away from Eastern India. They're pushing them back through Burma and Thailand into Southeast Asia. They're encountering tribesmen who are volunteering to fight against the Japanese. They're going to still active arsenals, pulling out these guns and issuing them to the tribesmen. These guns have been outdated by 150 years by this point, but they're still in pretty good shape, and so they're pulling them out. Now, I always tell folks that the British are the ones who are really devious. Americans have kind of somehow have gotten that bred out of their system. And that the British might have been thinking to themselves, at some point we might have to fight these tribesmen. And so we want to make sure that we immediately have fire superiority. We've got guys with machine guns, while they're going to still be using muzzle loaders. So, but these are slow guns to load. It's a trained British soldier could get off a shot every 20 seconds from these guns. And as a matter of fact, at one point in their training, that's exactly what they would focus on, is getting off one shot every 20 seconds and sustaining that rate of fire for 4 minutes. So in other words, they had to fire 12 shots within 4 minutes before they could even go on to their next level of training. Now, any of you who have ever shot a black powder weapon know that black powder is a tremendous fouling agent. I mean, when the first round goes off, the bore of the gun is just coated with this black sludge, and it smells bad. And so when you pull the ramrod out and you're loading the next round, you're getting that sludge all over your hands, all over the ramrod. That's where most of the patches on my breeches come from, because I would wipe my hands on my pants, and then they wouldn't get washed for a week, and it would start to dissolve. These are linen breeches. It would start to dissolve the linen. My wife would get mad at me. But then the very next round you fire, any sludge that's inside the barrel immediately, because of the heat of that second round, it immediately solidifies. And so the ramrod goes down very easily on the first, the second, the third round. By the time I get to the fifth round, the sixth round, I'm having to hammer it down the bore because of all the blockage that's in the muzzle, because of the spent black powder that was then solidified by the next round that's passing through it. And yet, if you read the pension applications of some of these men who are in their 70s, in some cases their 80s by the time they file these pension applications, many of these guys actually remember how many rounds they fired in a battle. The Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, or the Battle of Princeton, New Jersey, Yorktown. They can remember in a single engagement how many rounds they fired. And I don't see how these guys could have gotten off 50 or 60 rounds in a battle without just having to ultimately stop long enough to pour water down the barrel, which reliquefies all that sludge, and then using some kind of cloth to dry the barrel out so they could fire again. But then again, after you've been fighting for that length of time, there's probably a lot of other guys lying on the ground around you who don't need their muskets any longer, and you could just pick theirs up and start using their gun instead. Now, the British were another level of training. They were definitely taught how to use the bayonet, and they were trained very, very thoroughly in its use. And that's 17 inches of steel, ladies and gentlemen. It's slightly off. It's not parallel to the body of the musket itself. It leans slightly outward, and this is so that an individual using a ramrod can reload the musket without worry about impaling his hand on the bayonet. It is not sharp at all, not here along the blade. It's only sharp at the tip. This is a stabbing weapon. It's not a weapon that's meant to slash with. It's also a tremendous psychological weapon, and that's when children don't really understand this. Even my students are, what do you mean by psychological? This was meant to strike fear into the hearts of others. And British soldiers kept all the buttons on their coats shined. They kept their musket barrels shined. They kept their bayonets. And this is what's referred to as in the bright. They kept their muskets in the bright. And this was so if you had a British regiment with fixed bayonets moving towards the Americans, they would present this wall of shimmering light. And you would see these little thin, wicked-looking glimmers of light, and you would think those are bayonets. And when the British get over here, I don't feel like you're going to run through by 17 inches of steel, and also, too, the blade itself is not linear the way our modern bayonet blades are. It's triangular. It would form much more of a puncture wound in someone than it would form, a typical knife stab wound. And and the reason why it's triangular is triangular nature increases the tensile strength of the bayonet, but also, again, it's much more difficult to stop bleeding from a puncture wound than it is from a slash wound. So the American troops would usually break and run before the British would actually make contact with their bayonets. Now, during Valley Forge, when Baron von Steuben had shown up and was training the Americans on how to use bayonets, then it would be the turn of the British troops as they were getting closer and closer to the Americans, and they're thinking, when are they going to run? When are they going to run? And then they realize they're not going to run. Sometimes those British regiments, even over the orders of their officers, would falter before actually reaching the American lines because the Americans would have bayonets fixed too. So there's, again, not many people were killed with these during the American Revolution. The greatest example we have, though, of somebody who was killed was George Washington's best friend, Hugh Mercer, who was a general who fought with him at Trenton. They went on to fight at Princeton. At Princeton, he was leading one wing of the American Army. His horse was shot out from under him, and when he extricated himself from the horse, he realized he was surrounded by British troops who demanded he surrender. He drew his sword in response, and they bayoneted him to death. Now, it was probably a mistake. If they had figured out he was an American general, they probably wouldn't have done this. They would have called on him, they would have implored him to surrender. And but he had an overcoat on, which basically covered up his general's insignia, and so they probably thought he was just a common soldier, and they went ahead and killed him. And the interesting thing about Hugh Mercer, he's Scottish. He had studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and had served as a surgeon in Bonnie Prince Charlie's armies of 1745. He was at Culloden. And so it's interesting that he fought once against the British and 30 years later fought against them in another rising for the independence of of a country. Washington liked the way the British Army looked, and he really wanted us to look, he wanted the Americans to look as dressy as the British Army was. And so when the French actually joined us, when they joined our side, when we won the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, France realized the Americans are going to go the distance here. They're going to go to the very end. They're going to take this through to the very end. They became our allies, and they began to ship muskets and cannons and gunpowder and money and medicine. They shipped a lot of their army as well as their navy over to the North American theater of operations. But they also shipped thousands and thousands of uniforms. And these, so this is what's referred to as a lottery coat, because they were either blue with the different color facings on it, or they were brown with different color facings. Well, what Washington did was he took 13 of his officers. He basically put he put blue and brown written on pieces of paper in the hat, and he passed it around. It had each one. One of them drew for Georgia, one of them drew for South Carolina, one of them drew for North Carolina, one of them drew for Virginia. One drew for New York, one drew for Massachusetts, and whatever they drew, that was the color of coat that was issued to the troops. The individual who drew for Virginia drew blue, and so late in the war, most of the soldiers from Virginia would have still had the red cuffs, the red collars, and the red lapels, but they would be wearing these blue coats. The French got in one last jab at the British when they fabricated these coats. Ladies and gentlemen, there's 44 buttons on these coats, and I don't know. I mean, you got to look for some of them. Some of them are really kind of buried back here in the back, but every single one of these buttons contains the initials USA. The British never referred to us as Americans. They never referred to us as certainly never referred to us as patriots. Usually they referred to us as rebels, and with different colorful epithets tacked onto the front of that word, but they certainly did not recognize us as Americans. And so France was the first foreign nation to recognize us as the United States of America. And the way I've heard the story is the second foreign nation that recognized us as the United States of America were the Oneida Indians of New York State. We don't see native tribes as like business entities or anything like that. We see them as foreign governments. And so we can't come to just a simple agreement with them on something. We have to sign a treaty between the United States and these tribes. And the Oneida were one of the 6 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, which basically stretched from Lake Erie over in the west all the way to the Hudson River in the east. And the Oneida were the central, they were the precisely at the center of those 6 tribes that stretched across New York. They were the only large Indian tribe that actually sided with the Patriots during the American Revolution. There's a wonderful book called Forgotten Allies, and I can't remember what the author's name is, but it's the story of the Oneida Indians fighting on the side of the United States during on the sides of the Patriots during the American Revolution. These 6 tribes, again, strung across New York State, physically, but also mentally, they referred to themselves as the Covenant Chain. The 6, because they usually all agreed on, they would have a huge council meeting where representatives of all the tribes would show up. They would light a council fire, and they would discuss their issues and arrive at normally a unanimous decision. But when the Oneida decided to side with the Patriots during the Revolution, they broke the Covenant Chain. And I have been told that to this day, in New York State, the Oneida Indians, amongst other Native Americans, amongst other representatives of the previous Iroquois Confederacy, The Oneidas are still referred to as, they're still called the chain breakers to this day. So, but again, Holland went on to recognize us, Austria went on to recognize us. One of the things that I think is, and I'll share this with you, ladies and gentlemen, and then I'll stop and let you all ask any questions you might ask. When George III realized that the 13 colonies were in open rebellion against him, not just simply the colony of Massachusetts, but the other 12 as well, that we were all in open rebellion against them, he initially went to, he's of German extraction. He speaks English pretty well. He couldn't say that about his grandfather. George II kind of spoke English. George I didn't speak English at all. He always had translators with him as he was interacting with Parliament and other governmental entities. But George III becomes King of England when he's 25, and he initially went to another German princess. He went to Catherine the Great of Russia, because now Catherine the Great of Russia, she was actually a German princess who, her husband was, I think, Paul III, who'd been the Tsar of Russia. He had married her back in the 1760s, I think. And she then had him killed, and she became, basically the equivalent of Elizabeth the Great of England, but she was over in Russia instead. So initially, George III approached her about hiring 20,000 Russian troops and sending them over to the colonies to fight. Catherine had just subdued the largest peasant uprising in the 18th century, what was known as Pugachev's Rebellion. About 85,000 serfs had risen up against they had a certain number of Cossacks that were in there with them. They were marching on Moscow. They defeated several armies. She finally was able to bring the rebellion under control in Prussia. And so she said no, because she said, I need to keep all of my army here at home in case something like this happens, in just a short period of time. So the rest is history. George III turned to the principalities of Germany. He hired about 35,000 German soldiers. We refer to them as Hessians, just collectively, and that's not really completely accurate. Only a certain number of them were actually from the principalities of Hesse. There were also Brunswickers. There were Schleswig, Holstein, troops from the Palatinate, from Waldeck, several other smaller German principalities, and they sent those troops over here to fight against us. But wouldn't it have been interesting if we had fought against Russian troops 200 years before the Cold War actually started? I find that to be rather ironic. Are there any questions that any of you want to ask? Yes.
Your Patriots, Virginia?
Actually, South Carolinian.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your opinion, the top fighting general of the Revolution?
That's a good question.
Well, you're from South Carolina.
Well, yeah, people, okay, there are so many towns that are named Marion, because after Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and a tremendous guerrilla fighter who at sometimes only had 20 or 25 men with him, other times he had almost 1,000, and so yeah, I mean but just as far as there's some really stellar guys who served on the American side during John Sullivan, Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker. Matter of fact, his best biography is written by a man whose last name is Thrall, Thrall, and it's called The Fighting Quaker. He was read out of his congregation when he said he was going to go and fight with the Patriots. And that basically he was kicked out of the Quaker congregation. He's the only example we have of anyone during the course of the American Revolution who went from private to brigadier general during that single conflict. But he kind of takes a jump from private all the way up to colonel, and so it's kind of understandable, you know, that...
I was wondering, how did George, this 35,000, now he's going to have to pay these guys, right?
Oh, yeah.
How did, and along with his own troops, how did he expect to pay them?
Well, this is the interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen. It's a small technicality. These were not mercenaries. A mercenary is someone, in my understanding, a mercenary is someone who forms their own agreement with a rebel government or a rebel movement, and the agreement is between that particular soldier and that movement or that government. These were levies. The agreement was between George III and whoever their prince was over in Germany. That was who got the money. The Hessians just simply got their regular pay as soldiers. And as a matter of fact, there was a whole menu that if they serve this period of time and they come back home, you owe me this amount. If they get captured, you owe me this amount. If they get wounded, you owe me this amount. If they desert, you owe me this amount. And there was this whole menu of prices that George III had to pay to these princes in these different German states. And of course, the British made the really stupid mistake of landing most of them smack in the middle of Pennsylvania. Now, the Pennsylvania Deutsch, that we frequently know as the Pennsylvania Dutch, these are Pennsylvania Germans. And so these guys are marching through Pennsylvania. They're thinking to themselves, the fences are built the same way here that they are back home. The houses are built the same way they're built back home. The orchards are pruned the same way as they are back home. It's like I'm marching through Germany. A door would open and a young Fraulein would come out with a pitcher of milk speaking to them in German, and they're thinking to themselves, if I go back to Germany, I'm going to be in the same situation I was then. But maybe if I stay over here, I could actually unland. It's believed that 1 out of every 4 German soldiers that were landed in the colonies deserted. The British actually, there's officers who write in their journals that they would have to detail regiments to act as provost guard, to just keep an eye on the Germans as they're marching from point A to point B to make sure they don't run off. You know, keep them in their lines, make sure they stay here with us. And now, of course, there's lots and lots of Germans who returned home. But there's a number of them that did desert and joined the westward migration into Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. And even points further westward. Yes.
Can you go over the footwear, the shoes, the boots that the soldiers wore?
Yeah, these are what are called straight-lashed shoes, and the sergeants were told to go in every day and make sure that the men didn't switch their they did switch their shoes, because they didn't want one to form to the right foot and one to form to the left foot, and that's the reason why they're called straight lasts. They're just simply these almost shoe blanks. And but of course the men liked having a shoe that felt proper on the left foot and on the right foot, so they would try to switch them back as soon as the sergeant was gone. They're made completely out of leather, except obviously for the buckle. The heels are held on to the uppers with little wooden pegs. And so everything, and the stitching is done with linen thread. So at Morristown, New Jersey, when there was effectively no food for the Continental Army, a lot of soldiers were boiling their shoes to the point where they were very, very soft and they were eating their own footwear. And, but yeah, officers wore boots. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, I have a presentation just simply on slang that was used back in the 18th century, and you'll find remarkable similarities. In our generation of uses of English, we still are using these same terms. Terms like lock, stock, and barrel, don't go off half-cocked, flash in the pan, peachy keen, all that kind of stuff. And I'm sorry, folks, I'm trying to remember why I just brought that up. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. Macaroni was the slang term they used back then for basically being flashy. What the kids today would call the bling bling, that's macaroni. And he just stuck the feather in his hat. Well, British officers looked very, very macaroni-ish because, first of all, the color of red that was used in their coats was much more. It was actually scarlet. Their coats were very bright red, rather than being what's called madder red or brick red. They would frequently have all kinds of gold lacing up and down their sleeves. They would have gold lacing on their hat. They may well have a plume in their hat. They would be wearing riding boots, even though, because that was the mark of a gentleman, instead of the low shoes like what I have on. They would have a sword. They would have they would be wearing white leather gloves. They would frequently have a very wide red sash around their middle that was sometimes a foot wide. And the interesting thing, there was a functionality to that. If they got wounded on the battlefield, the soldiers who came up behind them could use their sash as a stretcher to move them off the field. They could just simply pull the sash out, lay the officer in it, pick up the ends, and take him off. Basically, he's carrying his own stretcher. Well, when they're going up Bunker Hill, the Americans are saying, that's an officer down there, I can tell. Oh, they would wear a piece of metal, right here referred to as a gorget, and it's the last vestiges of body armor. They're basically saying, my ancestors, those who came before me, were knights, and they of course dressed in all that armor, but this is the last vestige of body armor that I'm wearing. I too am a knight, even though I'm fighting in a different manner. Well, Americans were just picking those guys off. You know, they were seeing the officers and they were shooting them. There's the famous scene in Patriot where Lord Cornwallis is asking, please don't single the officers out any longer. And he says, well, then stop singling out civilians. You know, you stop what you're doing, we'll stop what we're doing. Well, there were points in the 8-year course of the American Revolution. All of the British officers that died, all of them taken together as a whole body, 25% of them were killed or wounded at Bunker Hill, because again they had the bling bling all over them. So pretty quickly, they're getting rid of those scarlet red coats. They're dropping the gorget. They're losing the sword. They're throwing out the sash. They're doing everything they can to look like the private who's standing right next to them, hoping they're not going to get singled out by American marksmen. And so, yes.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I've got 2 questions. The first, the easier one. Why would the British require the commanders to be able to speak French? You were telling us that was probably one reason we were...
Why Washington? Yeah.
Speak French. Why was that a requirement?
It's because the French were the enemy. And
I know they were the enemy, but why was that a requirement?
They wanted British officers to, they didn't want to have to go, hey, somebody go to the translator because this guy can't speak English. They wanted the British officer to be able to immediately present British Crown authority to them in their language. And so they just wanted them to know the language of the enemy. And so that was and it was a requirement. Evidently, it stopped more than just Washington from becoming an officer. And you said you had 2.
Yeah, the other question, demographics. You said earlier, 25,000 people died in the Revolutionary War on the American side, okay, of a population of 2.5 million.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering, do we have any record to say, of that 2.5 million, how many, and you said the war went 8 years.
Yeah.
How many sided with the Americans? How many sided with the British? I understand they were called the Loyalists. And how many were neutral? And so my question is, of that total population, do we have any idea of how much of the total population was on the side of the American cause?
Yeah, the typical things I've heard is just 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. In reality, I think it's probably 30% sided with the Patriots, 25 to 30% sided with the Loyalists, And probably a larger, slightly larger majority sat in the middle and waited to see which side was going to win, or which side was being favored more. And so maybe 30% on the Patriot side, 25 to 30% on the Loyalist side, and 40 to 45% in the middle. And so, and once again, a lot of those folks in the middle are conscientious objectors. There's more than just simply the Quakers. There's also the Dunkers, the Shakers, the Moravians. There's a lot of religious groups that just simply shunned fighting altogether. And then there were people who said, I'm in this for profit. I want to see which side's going to start to win, and that's going to be the side I'm going to cast my lot with.
Bill, I just was doing some prep for you to be here. One of the things that I read that might lead into what you're saying, Jack, if you take the population, 50% of the population in the United States at that time was below the age of 16.
Yeah.
So if you did, now you just start, now you're down to the Loyalists, half of those under 16. We had a very, very small group of people who were actually available to fight, and we lost 25,000 people.
And the other thing that we ignored was probably over 1 million slaves.
Yeah. Yeah, and the British capitalized on that. Lord Dunmore would issue his proclamation basically telling all the slaves, if you come over to the British side and fight for us, then we'll give you your freedom. And that kind of sort of worked, but not really very well.
When you fully understand that, you really appreciate what the Patriots did for all.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
In spite of all circumstances and all the odds against them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I think is interesting is, I believe the financier of the revolution was it Morris?
Yeah.
He went, and a Quaker friend in Philadelphia had a lot of money, and he went to him and said, I need some money. And the Quaker said with a wink, he said, I will make a personal loan to you, but this is not for the Army.
Mm-hmm.
So he took a personal loan, and of course used the money to support the troops or whatever he needed to do.
And as I've heard it, Robert Morris, that's who used to be, made and lost 2 fortunes during the American Road. He basically beggared himself. And so many of them were that way. Daniel Boone was never truly recompensed for anything he did. Von Steuben lived the rest of his life in like a 2-room house somewhere up in New York State. Said he didn't even want his grave to be marked when he was buried. And George Rogers Clark, who basically won the West for the Patriots, was never recompensed. And a little on a slightly darker side, ladies and gentlemen, the one uniformed militia group that showed up at the Siege of Boston was led by a very dedicated, very devoted officer. Washington actually commended this group because he said they're the only ones who are uniformed. They know how to march. They know how to they're just proper with their sirs and yes sirs and no sirs and whatnot like that. I mean, he actually used a British officer's body turned up over that had been found, and it was being sent back through the lines to the British. Washington just felt like that was a proper gesture. This guy's body needs to be sent back to the British. He detailed men from that particular militia unit to escort the body back over there. The captain in command of that unit was Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold, you asked about generals, he was one of the fightingest generals on the Patriot side. I mean, and as a matter of fact, when he was wounded in Quebec, he was shot in the left leg at Quebec. When they were storming the Bremen Redoubt, and last actual battle that took place, of all the many battles that made up the Battle of Saratoga, he was shot in the same leg. And I love reading about him because he's just a really, really fascinating guy. But it's believed that he actually betrayed the American cause because he had not been recompensed for anything that he had done. He had spent a lot of he'd been a merchant before the war, a very wealthy merchant, but but just felt like that. But when he was shot in that leg, the first officer who made it to him was a man named Henry Dearborn. He became a Supreme Court judge in New York State. Henry Dearborn pulled Benedict Arnold, pulled him out from under the horse. He said, "Where are you hit, sir?" and he said in the same leg, "I wish it had hit me in the heart." And I've always, I've always pondered, why did he say that? Because this is 3 years before his defection. Why did he say, "It hit me in the leg, hit me in the same leg, I wish it had hit me in the heart"? Why did he say that? And so it just, that's, to me, that's one of the unanswered questions about the betrayal of Benedict Arnold. Are there any other?
Yeah, one question here.
Yes.
About how many British soldiers were killed, do you have any idea?
You know, I'm not really sure. It would be, oh, I tell you what, I think it was definitely less than Americans. Because, as a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, we were going through a smallpox epidemic during the entire course of the American Revolution, from starting in 1773 and going all the way to 1784, where a huge epidemic was sweeping. So I think that probably more Americans were dying of disease than were definitely dying, on the
Battle of
British
New
side.
Orleans, was the armistice and the war over before that battle or after that battle?
You mean the War of 1812?
Yes, yeah, the war of 1812.
Okay, oh, that was excuse me.
Yeah, no, but that was true. The battle was fought 3 weeks after the armistice had been signed.
Okay,
The medical historians state that more patriots were killed by smallpox than by British.
That's probably true.
That's why they couldn't take Montreal.
Yes, yeah, the Patriot Army, which was already very, very small at that point, had smallpox sweeping through it. So, yeah, that's a really good
That was the
point.
chief killer in prison, right?
What's that?
That was one of the main killers in the prisoners.
Yes, yes, yeah. Thank you all very much for letting me speak today. Not sure how to turn it off.
Yeah, there's a power button on the back side.
Oh, okay.
I think it's okay. Yeah, go real quick.
Feedback.
There we go.
I think that was the ghost of Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, that was
Ready to go active.
that was excellent. I think everybody would have been willing to stay here a lot longer to hear more of what you had to say, so that was very good. We would like to present you with a certificate of appreciation and appreciate your time with us today. And also, we have a SAR
I don't have
Untitled
one.
Chapter coffee mug, so.
Thank you.
and
You're one of
your
the first to get that.
Yeah,
You might want to share that around Arlington.
yeah.
I can run real quick from
Very
here
good.
over there and say, hey guys, thank you.
Thank you.